All right. Well, it's 3 p.m. everyone, so let's get started. Welcome to the first winter CSSR webinar. Here today, I am your Zoom master, Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme, as usual. So I'm here kind of dealing with the tech side of things, making sure everything runs smoothly. During our first webinar, I'm going to pass the mic over to Kamer in the next few minutes to introduce our speaker. But first, just like a few little things about how it's going to run for the next hour or so. Our presenter, our speaker is going to talk for about half an hour. And then for another half hour afterwards, we'll have an open Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them then. You can put in the chat, you can put an indication that you'd like to ask a question at any time during the talk or during the Q&A. And then our chair, Kamer Hamid, will just call you out and then you can ask the question in person over your audio or with your video as well. Okay, without further ado, I pass the mic over to our chair for today, Kamer Hamid.
Oh, hi, everyone, and welcome to CSSR's first Winter 2021 webinar series. My name is Kamer, and I'll be chairing today. Just before beginning, I'd like to mention that the call for papers is out now for our annual meeting. So
hang on, sorry, I think Kamer got muted.
oh,
sorry about that. I'm sorry about that, Kamer. I think that was my fault. You got muted. So if you could we just were hearing about the call for papers.
Oh, okay. I was just saying that the call for papers has gone out for our annual meeting, and Sarah will be speaking to that a little bit later today. So today's session is delivered by our most recent CSSR Book Prize winner, Nicholas Shrubsole. Nicholas joined the Department of Philosophy at the University of Central Florida in 2015 as a lecturer in Humanities, Religion, and Cultural Studies. He received his PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Waterloo in 2013. Nicholas is a non-Indigenous person, a scholar ally. His research examines the existence and mechanisms of addressing the continuity of colonialism in Canadian law as it pertains to religious freedom and Indigenous state relations. He is the author of What Has No Place Remains, The Challenges for Indigenous Religious Freedom in Canada Today, which was published by the University of Toronto Press, and as I mentioned, it was the winner of the 2019 CSSR Book Prize. Nick is currently preparing to begin work on his second book project, examining the philosophical framework of cultural incommensurability as a pathway towards reconciliation, decolonization, and the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I will hand it over to Nicholas to begin his presentation, and we'll take questions at the end.
Thanks, Q. I appreciate that. Thank you so much to the CSSR for the invitation and setting this up. And thank you to all of you for coming. I see some students, I see some of my colleagues, I see some of my friends who don't do this at all, but just decide to come and hang out and listen to me talk, which is cool. And my mom's out there, happy birthday, Mom. And also, a lot of old friends and a lot of old professors that I don't get to see very often because I'm down here in Florida. But it's so great that you're taking the time out of your day to listen to me ramble on for 30 minutes and then have a little Q&A,
okay.
A related Q&A as well.
Okay. I'm really glad to hear that, Tara. Yeah, okay.
And there's Brian, not on mute. So good to hear you, Brian. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming out. And I also want to thank the University of Toronto Press. They agreed on very short notice to get a little discount code out to everyone in the webinar, which you'll get later this evening, I'm told. Just if you're interested in picking up the book, if you haven't read it yet, if you want to forward on that discount to somebody else you know that might enjoy the book, please do so as well. But yeah, so today I want to talk obviously about a little bit about my book, but it's been about 18 months since the book, sorry, it's been 16 months since the book was published. And for those of you who are familiar with the publication world, that means it's been over 2 years, about 2 years since I've actually touched the manuscript. So what I really wanted to do today is take the opportunity to think about the book post-book it's still going to be, I think, a good introduction to the book for those who are unfamiliar with it in a very roundabout, very reorchestrated way. And for those who are familiar with the book, and I know there's a few who I've spoken with about it on this webinar, it should be an interesting way of demonstration of how the book can be applied moving forward, thinking about the issues that are raised towards the end of the book, particularly when it comes to international rights mechanisms and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And before I get to that little talk, so you can see I have a sort of a subtitle here, a very lengthy subtitle, which is give you an indication of what I'm going to be talking about. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the work, let me make sure I'm, okay. There we go. All right. So for those unfamiliar with the work, I just wanted to give a very brief, I really just wanted to provide these slides so you could see some of the things that are engaged in the introduction of the book. It really is a book that seeks to understand the complex issues behind Indigenous religious freedom in Canada. It is framed through a number of different subjects that we find in law and religion, but also law, religion, and Indigenous studies as well. Particularly the 8th issue here, which is the idea of crown sovereignty, which I included as one of the 8 frameworks, interrelated 8 frameworks that I've decided to set the book up from. And I'll be talking about, I would actually say, 7 of these 8 today, maybe with the exception of the religious heritage of a country, which, if you're familiar with Indigenous religious freedom discourse in Canada, that might be the one thing you're already familiar with. So I'm actually going to not really talk about that as much. I'm going to be talking about the other 7 in parts, directly and indirectly throughout the presentation. And just as far as the book structure goes, there's 6 chapters, 6 subjects discussed. I'm going to be talking about many of these first 3 chapters, looking at the depth of religious freedom, how the courts understand religion and don't really understand it on a conceptual level, on a level of significance and meaning. I'm going to be talking about issues around secularization and the expectations of public religion coming from Jose Casanova's work. I talk about the sort of the challenges between Section 2A and Section 35, which are 2 different frameworks under the Constitution. Section 2A, the Charter right to religion. I thought it was important just to highlight it, to give you a sense of what's out there. We have discussion around diversity and the sort of evolving and changing, adaptive, fluid, diachronic nature of religion generally, but particularly when it comes to Indigenous religions in a colonial context, how the state deals with that. I look at the democratic processes of the duty to consult and accommodate, which I will talk about here briefly, but from the legal perspective, not the democratic processes side of things. And finally, I do look at international rights mechanisms before moving into discussion of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, trying to understand, how, given the analysis of the book, how what are some potential avenues of moving forward. And so that's really where a very, very general and quick overview, just to give you a sense of what's happening in the book. But as I mentioned, what I want to do today is actually talk about the book post-book. And so with that, now I know many of you, I think I didn't look at the entire participant list, but all of you know, I'm legally blind. So I'm going to be sitting really close to my iPad. I don't know if there's any value in seeing me or even recording me for it. So I'm going to actually turn off my camera, something I don't usually have the option to do. I'm going to leave my microphone on, let you look at the slides, and I'll come back when we are ready for Q&A. All right. On December 3, 2020, the House of Commons heard its first reading of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which purpose is to affirm the declaration as a universal international human rights instrument with application in Canadian law and provide a framework for the Government of Canada's implementation of the declaration. The act is notably late, marking just over 10 years since Canada signed the declaration, but the introduction of the bill is an important indicator of the potential persuasive power of international law and the government's seeming willingness to take seriously the final recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At the same time, Bill C-15 makes it clear that the Constitution will not be impacted by the declaration. The problem, of course, is that the declaration and the Constitution are incongruent. The government stated as much on November 12, 2010, when they finally signed the non-binding declaration with support for its spirit, so to speak, 3 years after they voted against it in the General Assembly. Nevertheless, 3 days later, the Ktunaxa Nation published the Ktunaxa Declaration, citing both Articles 12 and Article 25 of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In advance of a looming legal battle with Canada over the development of a year-round ski resort in the home of the grizzly bear spirit, central to Ktunaxa identity and culture. No ski resort was built on Ktunaxa, but not because the courts upheld Ktunaxa claims under the right to freedom of religion of the Charter or Aboriginal rights under Section 35 of the Constitution, nor was it the result of intervention by international bodies or recognition of the Declaration, a document that received no attention in the 2017 Supreme Court decision. No, an expired environmental assessment, general frustration from the resorts company after more than 25 years of trying to get the project started, and widespread discontent among local residents about the resort are just some of the fortuitous circumstances that resulted in the abandonment of the project, despite the Supreme Court's rejection of Ktunaxa claims. As of last year, Ktunaxa is now an Indigenous Protected Area, an IPA, for which the Canadian government played a major role in securing. Despite the early promise of IPAs new to Canada as of 2018, their success as a mechanism for protecting Indigenous religions will vary from case to case. And while IPAs may sometimes avoid the challenges of the constitutional framework, they will not overcome them. Canada was right in 2010. The Constitution and the Declaration are incongruent. To suggest that the Declaration can be fully implemented in Canada without constitutional reform is an impossibility. And I don't want to dwell on the details of Bill C-15, largely because it is just on its first reading, but the immediacy of the proposition of attempting to implement the Declaration calls us all to ask what challenges may be faced in such an endeavor. With that, I return to my book more directly to consider the 2 articles from the Declaration cited by the Ktunaxa Nation and the challenges that arose in their case, with attention to 3 of the 8 frameworks outlined in my introduction, namely incommensurability, equality, and assertions of Crown sovereignty, or put more simply, understanding, balance, and colonialism. I don't think it is too much of a leap to suggest that constitutionally, the constitutional protection of Indigenous religions requires an understanding of those traditions. In 1985, when the Supreme Court heard Jack and Charlie v. the Queen, they concluded that the killing of a deer by 2 Coast Salish men was not part of their religion and was in violation of the 1966 Wildlife Act. The court determined what constituted religion in a legal context, but the law is located within its own culture, as are the judges who interpret those laws, and no culture is static. The breadth of what gets included within legal religion appears to expand over time, culminating in the benchmark of sincerity for a religious freedom claim as articulated in the Amsterdam decision. I suggest that under the S2A Charter rights, freedom of religion, the contents of indigenous religions have largely been accepted by the courts, rendering Jack and Charlie the product of a bygone era. But the expansion of breadth has brought into focus a lack of depth. In 1998, the only other indigenous religious freedom case considered under Section 2A, the BC Supreme Court told the Kelly Lake Cree Nation that religious freedom did not include the defilement of a concept, namely stewardship, where there is no actual deprivation or incursion of religious freedom. In this case, the Kelly Lake Cree Nation claimed exploratory drilling of sacred mountains in northeastern BC on Treaty 8 territory infringed on their stewardship of the area, which did not include a physical presence at the mountains. The decision to protect the top of the mountains from drilling and allow varying degrees of drilling towards the base of the mountain range was satisfactory for some indigenous communities, but not the Kelly Lake Cree. The court was willing to read intellectual stewardship under religious freedom, but they were not willing to protect it. I'll return to that nuance shortly when I attend to the subject of balance. In the same lower court in 2014, the Ktunaxa Nation were told that religious freedom did not extend to loss of meaning for actions. Importantly, the belief in the significance of the space was recognized as sincere in Katmuk, as were associated practices, but the integrity of the space itself was not. In the majority decision in the Supreme Court of Canada, Chief Justice McLaughlin clarified that religious freedom protects belief and the manifestation of belief, but not the object of belief, referring to the grizzly bear spirit and its presence in Katmuk. McLaughlin, like the lower courts, had failed to recognize that the protection of belief and the manifestation of belief was intimately tied to the protection of Katmuk. Aboriginal rights are a better mechanism for redress for Indigenous religious freedom, but it too struggles with comprehending Indigenous religions. Notwithstanding examples like the BC Supreme Court Siska Creek Band decision, where the judge suggested that the community could, and I quote, conduct rituals in many of the other pristine places that exist within their traditional territories, the integral to a distinctive culture test established in Vanderpeet renders legal religion under Section 35 as beliefs and practices that are both communal and predate European contact. In the Ktunaxa Nation case, the no middle ground position that effectively ended negotiations between the Ktunaxa and the state, which essentially said that no development whatsoever could take place in Katmuk, was communicated in 2009 by one elder. The evidence, as interpreted by the state, suggested that the belief was not widespread, nor could it be understood to be a pre-contact belief. The belief was accepted as sincere and thus legal religion under Section 2A, but not under Section 35. Chapter 3 of my book explores these contradictions in detail, but the fact is that the historicization of Indigenous religions is a common assertion that hinders the understanding of those very traditions, where, as Vine Deloria Jr. teaches, the canons are not closed. There is a fundamental misunderstanding of Indigenous religions at work in Canadian legal culture and the law itself. If conceptual integrity and meaning cannot be protected, then Indigenous religions are without protection under the Charter. If Indigenous religions are understood as historicized, then the contemporary realities of Indigenous religions, particularly during the colonial encounter, are under threat. How then might Canada uphold sections 12 and 25 of the Declaration? For their part, Justices Michael Moldaver and Susan Cote were conscious to the potential implications of the majority decision in Ktunaxa Nation. Moldaver wrote, "The minister's decision to approve the ski resort will render all of the Ktunaxa's religious beliefs related to grizzly bear spirit devoid of any spiritual significance. Accordingly, the Ktunaxa will be unable to perform songs, rituals, or ceremonies in recognition of grizzly bear spirit in a manner that has any religious significance for them." He continues, with respect to my colleague's approach to protecting my colleague's approach amounts to protecting empty gestures and hollow rituals rather than guarding against state conduct that interferes with profoundly personal beliefs, the true purpose of S2A's protections. Unfortunately, Moldaver and Cote only disagreed with the reasoning, not the decision, which brings me to the second theme, balance. Moldaver concludes, granting the Ktunaxa a power to veto development over the land would effectively give the Ktunaxa a significant property interest in Katmuk, namely a power to exclude others from constructing permanent structures on over 50 square kilometers of public land. This right of exclusion is not a minimal or negligible restraint on public ownership. It gives the Ktunaxa the power to exclude others from developing land that the public in fact owns. The public in this case includes an Aboriginal group, the Shuswap Indian Band, that supports the development. I will return to this reasoning shortly, and don't worry, we will get to the idea of public ownership in a few minutes. First, it is important to note that Aboriginal rights were incorporated in the Constitution to ensure that Indigenous peoples occupied a special legal status in Canada that set them apart from other Canadians as communities whose existence on the continent predate European settlement. This was, in part, a response to the classic liberal ideals that manifested in the 1969 White Paper, which sought to remove the special legislative status of Indigenous peoples. Despite the colonial tone and underpinnings of the existing federal Indian law, Indigenous leaders at the time understood that such an act would strip Indigenous peoples of their territory and identity, effectively ensuring the erasure of indigeneity. Thus, this affirmation of Aboriginal rights in the Constitution was an important victory for Indigenous rights. However, under the Charter, Indigenous peoples don't get to be Aboriginal peoples. That is a legal designation, a legally designated category of people with special rights. In the context of the Charter, Indigenous peoples are treated as one group among many other equal groups with diverse interests and perspectives. All Charter rights are subject to Section 1, such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. The Oakes test used to assess the legality of an infringement of a Charter right mandates the government to prove that their infringement is for pressing and substantial reasons, which is a burden that is typically met quite easily in indigenous religious freedom cases where the local and provincial economies are in play, as we see in the minority reasoning of Moldaver and Kote. The government must also ensure that infringements are both minimal and proportional, which in this case necessarily requires a comprehensive understanding of indigenous religions. How else are you going to know if it's minimal and proportional? A task the courts are incapable of dealing with, as noted already. It also requires indigenous peoples to participate in the conditions of public religion, namely negotiation and compromise with all other equal and diverse parties in the democracy. In the Kelly Lake Cree Nation case, the lower court made it clear assertions of the freedom of religious practice is a discrete issue that relates to all Canadian citizens, before criticizing the Kelly Lake Cree Nation for not negotiating and the Saulteaux First Nation, the other party in that claim, for being idealistic in their objection to the division of sacred mountains into zones that allowed, in the view of the court, for both socioeconomic development and stewardship. In the Ktunaxa case, Moldaver and Kote understood that the remedy sought by the Ktunaxa was too burdensome on the rest of society, including another indigenous community, instead suggesting that the accommodations that were reached were acceptable. In general, the overwhelming consensus in legal scholarship is that the courts have tended to uphold the protection of belief in religious freedom cases while significantly limiting other aspects of religion, which is particularly devastating when land is the central matter of discussion. Unfortunately, Section 35 has its own challenges with respect to expectations of negotiation and compromise. In R.V. Sparrow, the Supreme Court found that Section 35 does not promise immunity from government regulations in a society that, in the 20th century, is increasingly more complex, interdependent, and sophisticated, and where exhaustive resources need protection and management. It does hold the crown to a substantive promise. An Aboriginal right may be infringed if there is a valid legislative objective, at which point the government has a duty to consult and accommodate in their efforts to infringe the right as minimally as possible to provide or to provide compensation. The benchmark of a valid legislative objective is typically met quite easily, triggering a consultation process that has been defined quite clearly as a right to speak, but not necessarily a right to be heard or to be understood. It is not a veto power. The Ktunaxa Nation did not raise the question of whether the state had a valid legislative objective in approving the permit for the ski resort. Rather, they focused on the consultation and accommodation process. On this matter, the Supreme Court found that the minister had sufficiently consulted, understood, and provided adequate accommodations in the plan for the ski resort. The Chief Justice concluded, while the goal of the consultation process is reconciliation of the Aboriginal and state interests, in some cases this may not be possible. The process is one of give and take, and outcomes are not guaranteed. Under both S2A and S35, Indigenous peoples are asked to negotiate and compromise their traditional territories. They are asked to negotiate their religions. The problem, of course, is that sacred space is more often than not non-negotiable. Thus, it seems that the integrity of cosmologically significant space cannot be guaranteed under the current constitutional order. In light of these realities, it seems impossible that the state will be able to guarantee Indigenous peoples, and I quote again, the right to maintain, protect, and have access to their religious and cultural sites, or the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationships with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands and territories without conforming to conditions of public religion, compromise, and negotiation with state interests and the wider Canadian society. A central fixture of the colonial project was the dispossession of Indigenous lands. Justified by divine right, philosophical assertions regarding ownership, and cultural racism, the seizure of Indigenous territories paved the way for the settlement and expansion of modern-day Canada. Where treaties were negotiated, reservation lands were often smaller than anticipated and located in places most suitable for European settlement and development. In BC, where very few treaties were signed, the contemporary treaty process causes many to literally grow old at the negotiating table. This means that many sacred sites, including cosmologically significant spaces, fall outside of Indigenous controlled territories. As a point of reference, Indigenous peoples control less than 0.4% of the landmass in British Columbia. This means that most Indigenous peoples who come before the courts under Section 2A or Section 35 do so out of necessity, not out of desire. In the book, I call this forced deprivatization. Notably, the process demands publicity of what may be otherwise considered private or secret knowledge. One of the reasons why the no middle ground position was presented so late in the Ktunaxa Nation case. In the context of what I've presented thus far, Indigenous peoples are faced with an impossible choice: engage with the state and negotiate their religious traditions and risk the loss of those traditions, or protest, do not engage, and risk the loss of those traditions. Colonization transformed Indigenous territories into crown lands and public lands. The contemporary landscape that forces Indigenous peoples into the public sphere to find protection for their religions is a result of crown sovereignty. And it just so happens that crown sovereignty lies at the foundations of Aboriginal rights. Sadly, assertions of crown sovereignty rest on nothing more than the colonial ideology of superiority itself. The Supreme Court clarified that the purpose of Aboriginal rights is to reconcile the prior occupation of Canadian territory, by Aboriginal peoples with the assertion of crown sovereignty over that territory. The Sparrow decision clarifies there was from the outset never any doubt that sovereignty and legislative power, and indeed the underlying title to such lands, vested in the crown. Supporting this claim are elements of the Calder decision and the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which Joshua Ben David Nichols explains in his forthcoming contribution to Indigenous voice and cultural appropriation, boils down to Aboriginal peoples did not have sovereignty over their lands because they were uncivilized. This remains fixed in the constitutional order. Therefore, the colonial foundations of Aboriginal rights must be addressed for any protection of Indigenous religious traditions. Thus, assertions of crown sovereignty based on long-standing colonial ideologies facilitated the dispossession of Indigenous territories and forces Indigenous peoples into a position where they are asked to publicly negotiate their religions within a legal culture and law that seems to misunderstand those very traditions. The situation is not much different under the Charter. The Declaration and the Constitution are incompatible, at least on the matters of Articles 12 and 25 as discussed today. It may be helpful to recognize that the Declaration itself offers its own contradictions. Article 46 of the Declaration affirms the sovereignty of the Crown and its territorial integrity, and principles of equality, not unlike that of Section 1 of the Canadian Charter. In this respect, the implementation of the entire Declaration cannot be done successfully in Canada, if anywhere. Short of substantive constitutional reform and the creation of a new proclamation, as articulated by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Bill C-15 will certainly not live up to the lofty goals of decolonization as stated in its preamble. Of course, not everything ought to or needs to come before the law if those principles of the Declaration penetrate the culture and fabric of Canada. Short-term solutions are still needed for the immediate threat to Indigenous religions in Canada, but long-term change begins with knowledge and understanding right now. Bill C-15, for better or for worse, may help to facilitate such knowledge building, even if just in the act of exposing the continuity of colonialism in the Canadian legal order and its related structures that continue to seek the transformation and eradication of Indigenous religions. Thanks. And this is the conclusion of the book, the very final paragraph, if you want to skip right to the end. But just thought I'd throw that up there too. I think it shares a lot of the similar kinds of ideas and sentiments that I expressed today.
Thanks very much, Nicholas, for your presentation. As one of the reviewers of the books for the prizes last year, I found your work to be very important and timely for our discipline, but also beyond that, especially considering people and systems often take definitions of religion, the foundations of the country or state, and legal machinery we use, such as law, for granted. And I would just like to say that I think your work is really important for us all to be thinking about right now. I'll open the floor for questions, and if you could raise your hands, I think that would be a good way for us to organize the order of questioners. Rachel, I did see you raise your hand. Did you have a question, or was that just by accident?
I was clapping.
Okay.
It's so hard on Zoom when you try to clap for a speaker, so I was clapping.
No
but
problem.
I'll think of something
Thank you,
when you
Rachel.
come back.
Sure. David, I see that you have your hand raised.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I have already enjoyed your book, and the presentation helped me think through some of it more. And I just have a question about something you raised at the very end about the contradictions in the not the charter, but what's the, I guess it was UNDRIP that you raised, the contradictions,
Yeah.
right? And if those contradictions, my question is basically, if those contradictions are an outcome of the contradictory nature of settler colonialism and then trying to bring Indigenous peoples into a legal framework within which they've been excluded from the writing of the Constitution or the founding document, or meaning therefore that UNDRIP can't really do anything without more radical change, or if there's some way to move forward from this this space of these immovable forces, right? My question is,
Yeah.
what do we do?
Good question. So the first thing, the only reason we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is because of Article 46. That was a joint effort to create the declaration. And there is a lot of stuff that had to be taken out in order for member states to approve it, and certainly for it to get through the support that it did in the General Assembly. There was some very, if you read early drafts, and I do talk about that, I think, in the introduction in the 6th chapter of the book, some of the early drafts had that very sort of, that language that was trying to act as a sort of decolonizing mechanism. And I mean, states just wouldn't have it. And so there was this sense that in order to even get something done after 20 years of work on that document, that Article 46 had to get included, and it was the concession of the states, and it speaks directly to that tension between what is the Constitution, right? And Article 35, Article 35, Section 35, to be exact. That tension between Crown sovereignty and the pre-existence of Indigenous peoples, territories, economic, political, religious systems on the same territory. And that tension is present within UNDRIP because of countries like Canada. It still didn't go far enough. Things like FPIC, free and prior informed consent, are very hard to do if you're also supporting the integrity and sovereignty, the land integrity and the land sovereignty of the state. So there's a lot of contradictions in it. And my understanding from the work that I've done in it is it is more of a conversation piece. It's more meant to be a pressure piece. It is something that can hopefully advance conversations in each unique jurisdiction in order to have those conversations taking place. And having a document, even if it has its errors, out there as prominent as the UNDRIP, getting read regularly, getting sort of approved in British Columbia, being put onto the House of Commons floor, regardless of whether or not it can or cannot be implemented fully. I don't think that was the intent of UNDRIP by the end, even though it may have started at that stage. If it was the intent, they would have moved towards a convention, but we already have that in International Labour Organization Convention number 169, which a handful of states have signed, but almost nobody is signing it, and Canada is not going anywhere near it, largely, even though the UN reporter keeps saying, hey, you should sign that. They're not going to sign it because of it would hold them legitimately accountable in the international sphere to decolonization. They're just not going to do that. So where do we go from here is the hard question. The fact is that tension's not going anywhere with our current constitution. The tension is there. And I think the best I can do at this point, my offering from what I've read and the limited things I know, is that it is about transformation at a fundamental cultural level. It's about making sure that lawyers and judges are reading UNDRIP, and then beyond that, my next project, trying to understand how one understands another culture without simply trying to see it as a distortion of themselves, which I think has caused a lot of problems in Canada thus far, in the legal context for Indigenous peoples thus far, and in the United States too. But yeah, I mean, I'm still really on board with a lot of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report had to say. That's what the final chapter of the book is about, which really calls for greater education, a new, negotiation of a new proclamation, and if possible, constitutional reform. But without that, it's going to be touch and go, as it always has been for Indigenous communities and their religious freedom.
Joel, I see that you have your hand up.
Thanks. Hi, Nick. I haven't read your book yet. I look forward to doing so. I read your article in Studies in Religion a number of years ago now. My question is this conversation on forced deprivatization and whether you see that as somewhat distinct to Indigenous communities, or do you see parallel to other religious groups whereby there's a level of shared synergy, if you will, across different religious contexts?
That's a great question, and it's one I've been thinking about for a while. And I believe had some conversations with Brooke Broussard, and I'm sure most of you know, I think way back at some AAR about this, because I was curious if Mormons have, might have this sort of encounter and experience, but I don't know of any other sort of situations where this might occur, given the reality of land-based traditions, the centrality of land in many Indigenous religious traditions, and the fact that those lands are not controlled by Indigenous peoples. And obviously the value of resource development and the value of land, right? How land is valued. So from my best understanding, and obviously don't know all the different contexts that could arise, but it is unique to Indigenous communities, because obviously in the context where I'm borrowing, I'm sure for those of you who aren't familiar with Jose Casanova's work, this idea of deprivatization is one that is sort of meant to be a choice. It's, do you want to come into the public sphere and engage in and change the public in some way? And if you want to do that, then you've got to come in with an open mind, accepting of other people, and trying to find a middle ground somewhere, or trying to negotiate and compromise, or make publicly intelligible arguments that others will understood outside of your faith tradition in order to invoke those changes. And of course, Casanova's examples are all Christian, and particularly, I'm always thinking of his chapter on fundamentalism, where he says, well, if they don't want to do it, they can go back to their isolated hamlets and protect the worth of their sectarian wares. Still one of my favorite lines from that book. And Indigenous peoples can't do that. They can't go back to protect the worth of their sectarian wares. Literally, Indigenous religions are under negotiation. This isn't negotiating an idea about how the world ought to be organized or how society ought to be organized. Although that is how the state conceptualizes it, but this is what we're doing. We're talking about public land, talking about crown land. So let's talk about how we as a community, as a society, as a nation are going to work with this. And if you have one perspective, well, there's other perspectives. And so it seems like Indigenous peoples are a real loss, and this situation of forced deprivatization is unique to Indigenous peoples in Canada, and likely elsewhere, but certainly in Canada.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
I don't see any other hands up, but I would like to ask a question.
Kamer, Brian also has a question when you're ready.
Yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks, Nick. I haven't had a chance to oh, sorry, there's that thing again. I haven't had a chance to read your book either, but I found your talk really interesting, and it overlaps a little bit with my own work, although not just on religion and politics. What I wanted to ask you is, obviously Canada was sort of your case studies, for what you were doing. Do you know how much of this maps, does it map just quite simply onto other Western democracies, or conversely, is there anything about the Canadian situation that's particularly unique or different? I know that wasn't the focus of your book, but I'm just curious if you know anything.
No, that's a great question. And thank you, Dr. Caruana. Brian recently got his PhD from UT. Completed that. I actually did not set up this question, but I do have a book right here that's going to help answer that question. And I was hoping somebody would ask me about sort of how it works elsewhere. And so I will hold this one up and advertise a colleague of mine's book. Michael McNally's Defend the Sacred in Native American Religious Freedom Beyond the First Amendment. Really great book. If you're at the AAR next year, if there is an AAR next year in San Antonio, will be there on a panel. I'll be there on a panel responding to the book with Winifred Sullivan, Jace Weaver, and Greg Johnson. And I bring that up because this book is ridiculously similar to my book. And so it made me think about how many similarities there are with the US. When I first got on this project, I thought about doing comparative work. And I mean, US context is pretty big. And Canada, there was there wasn't that much work being done in Canada, aside from a handful of articles here and there. And so Canada was a big enough project all by itself. And so I kind of abandoned my comparative look, knowing that there was good work out there in the US already. But my minimal sort of early readings thought that Canada was really different. And we are different in the fact that there's a constitutional, Aboriginal rights makes Canada different. But that's not to say that federal Indian law in the United States doesn't create some of the same requirements of the state in its engagement with Indigenous peoples. And so I think there's a lot of overlap when it comes to Aboriginal rights and what's going on in the United States, even though it's not, they're running into a lot of the same issues. If you're familiar with the Ling decision, that famously, kind of what I said with the Moldover line, it's this, it's our land. The government can do whatever it wants with its land. That's still the overwhelming premise in the United States. But there are a lot of different avenues for protection. And as this book says in the title, beyond the First Amendment, religious freedom is tough. It's problematic in Canada as it is in the United States. I would say it's maybe more so problematic in the United States, or at least maybe it's more obtusely problematic in the United States because of the substantial burden element that claimants must first make. They must actually raise their religious claims to the level of significance before the state will protect it, which is inverted in Canada. It's still here. So the charter right is a little different, but what's really interesting is the difference, and where I think there's real value in comparison, is looking at the different opportunities for protection that extend beyond. For instance, the Indigenous protected areas is new as of 2018. It's very common within Australia for the last several decades, 3 decades. And we'll see how that plays out. But those kinds of methods are different ways for the practical protection of spaces right now when possible. So there is a lot of cross stuff with US and Canada. You don't hear it so much elsewhere around the world. It's funny talking to some European scholars who just say, wow, Indigenous scholars who are interested in religion and this whole discussion around religious freedom and the law is a little bit foreign. And it does seem a bit unique to Canada and the United States for whatever reason. I haven't got into that yet, but yeah, I think definitely Canada is unique in some respects, particularly around the constitutional order and the nuances of religious freedom discourse and how it's played out. But I think more generally, there are some big standards, commonalities that are major impediments to religious freedom, both here and in the United States.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. I do see another hand up, and I think that might be the last question that we can take today. And I do not want to mispronounce your name, so I will let you tell us how to pronounce it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Xochitl Quetzal. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. And I just want to ask, it seems to me that the negotiations and the regulations are based on the centrality of the land for the Indigenous communities. And I was wondering if there is any other category that it might be easier to deal with or to negotiate between the government and the Indigenous communities. Or maybe it's because the land is so central and it's something that is tangible, that is so present. That is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a great question. the reason I focus on what I do is because of how challenging it is to grasp conceptually. The cosmologically significant, the term that I use awkwardly maybe in the book, is cosmologically significant space. And it is meant to differentiate from ritual space and graveyards, things like that, which have found far more protection under Canadian law. Even in the Ktunaxa case, there was no ceremonial. There was, I think, 2 ceremonial spaces in Ktunaxa in the region that was under development. Both of those spaces were protected. The extent of those spaces, that's the other thing. It's just the boundaries get created based on use and occupation and proof of use of those spaces. And so this is why I say kind of the breadth is there to some extent. There's this understanding, okay, this space is important for ritual practice, but the understanding of why that space is important and its connection to other things is, I said they failed to recognize. I don't think that's letting them off the hook. Failed to recognize. I think there is a intent to not include these things as protected elements of religious freedom. But I think that's because they're so difficult to grasp. It's hard. And this is one of the interesting things that it seems like whenever you read case law, it's like, do they just think this is too hard and they don't want to do it? Because when you see ceremonial sites or you see burial sites, and even repatriation is getting better, although you're always going to run into problems with private ownership, even on matters of land. It's better. Even access to religious ritual space in prisons, which is another big subject in Indigenous religious freedom discourse, is generally moving towards somewhere better. But this subject of land and cosmologically significant space is where it really bumps up against the wall, and colonialism kind of shows its face. I mean, this is ever present and always there because of the value, and however you want to phrase it, as a state interest or a viable legislative interest or whatever it might be. I mean, it's money for the state and its integrity, and it's a challenge to the sovereignty. And the entire state is based on this concept of crown sovereignty. Without it, it crumbles and it has no foundation, even though those foundations are weak. So, are there other terms or concepts or other things that, we could talk about, or, that do get talked about? There are, but it is, I still think it's these cosmologically significant spaces, or the cosmological, the sacredness, or the conceptual or the meaning behind these things that doesn't get any attention in religious freedom discourse, and seems not to get any attention under Section 35 either. So I may have answered your question there, but I hope that gave some insight into it.
Thank you. We see that the legal system has not appropriately been able to offer Indigenous rights and freedoms the dignities and reciprocities they require. And it sounds like even the successes are fraught with challenges. And while I'm really curious to hear your views, I do realize we're nearing our end time. So I'd like to thank you for talking to us today, providing us with your insights, and we look forward to your new project. I'd like to give you a few moments for your last words, and then hand it over to Sarah for some updates.
Sure, I will end sharing my screen, or did I?
I already did it.
Oh,
no worries.
I did. Thank you all again for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the CSSR for the invitation. It's a lot of fun. I'm down here in Florida, down here in Orlando, and I'm still research active and all that. I teach a lot of intro classes. So it's, and I bring in my own work into those classes too, but getting these opportunities, I really appreciate and cherish. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nicholas. It was great. Just a couple announcements before we head out. Please join us for our next webinar series. It takes a similar format to today's. We'll be joined by Jonas Brandt, MA student from McMaster University. Jonas was our winner of the 2019-2020 Student Essay Award. And so he's going to be presenting his work from that paper, The Politics of the Hidden Soul, Judicial Ethics in Augustine's City of God. So that's on March 4th, 3 p.m. So same day of the week, same time as today. And you sign up using the same Google form. Some of you might have already seen it there. So if you're interested, please do sign up, and then I'll send you the Zoom meeting details as usual. And then finally, as Kate Moore mentioned at the start of the talk, our call for papers is now open. So this is for our 2021 annual meeting at the end of May and start of June. We're super excited. We're going virtual. We're going synchronous. For all CSSR paid members, it's free to attend. Membership starts as low as $30 for the year. So hopefully super accessible to many of you. And so, you know, if you've got a paper, you've got a session, you want to take part in the conference, go and submit your proposal. Proposals are open, can be submitted until March 1st. And I've put the link up there to the website where you can find the call for papers. We also sent around a special newsletter yesterday, so check your inboxes for that from the CSSR, and the links will be in there too. Might be a bit easier for you to access that way. All right, so with that, thank you all for being here. Thanks again to Nicholas, and I wish you all a happy end of January, happy winter term if I don't see you before the end. And yeah, have a great afternoon and great weekend when we get there. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks.
Bye.